Classic Pokemon versus modern Pokemon. Which is better and why? This is something I see brought up a lot, especially over the last few years. A lot of fans say they think that classic Pokemon is better, but what exactly does that mean? First, there's a few important questions we have to answer. They are, what is classic Pokemon? What is modern Pokemon? And what makes each of these eras good or bad? Now before we get too far into the video, I just wanted to mention that if you want to support the channel, the best way you can do it is by leaving a like, so definitely do consider doing that. Especially since less than 20% of people who watch my videos even leave a like, but on average, more than 50% of the people who watch the videos watch until the very end. And of course, subscribe for more Pokemon videos. I will be going over every generation briefly in this video, but we have to lump them into categories to give us a more broad approach, since I'll mainly be looking at what each generation added to the Pokemon franchise rather than reviewing each game. For classic Pokemon, it would consist of the first 4 generations, of course, with modern Pokemon consisting of anything Generation 6 onward. This is universally agreed upon based on what I have seen people consider to be classic and modern Pokemon, but Generation 5 stands out and is up for debate. Some people lump it into modern Pokemon since it was when the franchise first took more of a turn to make the games a bit easier, while others lump Generation 5 into classic Pokemon since it was the last 2D Pokemon game and creates an easy divide between the 3D Pokemon games and the 2D Pokemon games. While Generation 5's placement in this is completely subjective, as well as most of the points I'll discuss in this video being subjective, I'm going to include Generation 5 as an in-between era of the classic and modern era of Pokemon, as it was more of a transitional period for Pokemon for reasons we'll discuss later in the video. So starting off with classic Pokemon, we have to consider nostalgia as a huge factor for why people love this era of Pokemon so much. It's the driving force behind pretty much all Gen 1ers, and chances are if you're a fan of Pokemon, your first game was most likely from one of the first 4 generations. Game Freak and Pokemon in general tend to favor a lot of Pokemon from this era because of this. While it may seem like everyone complains about Generation 1 Pokemon, especially Charizard and Pikachu, constantly being promoted ahead of cooler Pokemon like Swalot from later generations, there is no denying that Generation 1 Pokemon are the most recognizable and loved Pokemon among the majority of fans, especially the more casual ones. Since this topic is aimed to be more focused on the games themselves, however, we have to look at each main series game as well and not just the Pokemon themselves. Since some of these games are so old, we have to take that into account as fairly as possible, since the era in which the games were new is very important to consider as well. So starting off with Pokemon Red and Blue, or Green for the 0.2% of my viewers who are from Japan, this is as bare bones as Pokemon gets. I guess you could lump Yellow in here as well, and the games being bare bones is very fitting since they were the first games in the franchise and everything that came after them just built upon these games. These games have more of a nostalgia factor than any other game in the entire series, largely due to people called Gen 1ers who are Pokemon fans who grew up with Generation 1 and think they're the best thing ever. While the Generation 1 games aren't bad by any means, and did get an improvement with the remake games in Generation 3, they do still have their fair share of flaws and don't really hold up too well in modern times. Now again, I can't really knock them for that too hard though, but even for the time when they were released, they had more than their fair share of issues compared to other games released at the time. The biggest issue I have with Generation 1, aside from it aging rather poorly, are the many glitches and oversights that made their way into the final release versions of these games. While there are some glitches that you have to go out of your way to perform, like the Missing No glitch, add charm to the Generation 1 Pokemon games, there's still plenty of glitches and oversights that you could easily run into during a normal playthrough of the games. Luckily, with the release of the Generation 2 Pokemon games, many of the problems were fixed, as Generation 2 has far less glitches and oversights that would upset normal gameplay, and also added a lot of key improvements to the Pokemon franchise that remain staples even to this day. Generation 2 did a fantastic job expanding upon Generation 1, with one of the most defining features being able to travel back to Kanto in the post-game. These games set the standard for Pokemon games having some sort of post-game content, something that you don't typically see in other games. On top of that, Generation 2 added things like breeding, held items, and shiny Pokemon, all of which are loved additions that still exist in Pokemon games today. When it comes to the regular gameplay of Generation 2, it's a lot like Generation 1, something that all of the classic Pokemon games share. The classic Pokemon games have much less of a focus on a story involving some sort of evil team, and place most of the game's focus on you becoming the champion, especially in Generation 1 and 2. Leading into Generation 3, we did start to see more of a focus on a story involving an evil team with Team Aqua and Team Magma, which would continue to expand as the series progressed of course, although we wouldn't see a huge shift in the focus being on the story until Generation 6 and the modern era. With Generation 3 we saw more of a focus on a story involving an evil team with Team Aqua and Team Magma, which would continue to expand as the series progressed, although we wouldn't see a dynamic shift in the focus being on some sort of evil team or some sort of other story until we get closer to the modern era. Similar to Generation 2, Generation 3 added a lot of key features to Pokemon that still exist today. Although they aren't as impactful as Generation 2 was, we saw the introduction of abilities which make Pokemon stand out a bit more, as well as an expansion upon breeding and held items from the previous generation. In the classic era of Pokemon, there was much more innovation and interesting new features, something that is absent in the modern Pokemon games. One of the more underrated aspects of Generation 3 in my opinion were all of the events. While you can't easily replicate them anymore since the Pokemon games are old and the events only last when the generation is the newest in the timeline, Generation 3 had some of the coolest events out of any generation in my opinion. There was the Deoxys event which unlocked a new area on the map, the Mew event which also unlocked a new area, and various fun event-only Pokemon that were obtained through things like the Pokemon Coliseum bonus disc, or a random in-person event at Nintendo World or some other store. Generation 3 was also when we saw the first remake game introduced to the Pokemon franchise in Fire Red and Leaf Green, which did a great job improving upon and fixing the original Pokemon Red and Blue games. While they might not have had the same charm as the originals to someone who grew up with the originals, I still think that Fire Red and Leaf Green are the best way to play through Generation 1 game even today. They also added the Serebii Islands to Fire Red and Leaf Green to give them even more of a post-game, whereas Ruby and Sapphire didn't really have that. This seems to be a common trend with Pokemon games ever since Red and Blue. The first game released on a new console tends to be more bare bones, while the second game tends to build upon that and have extra features like a more expensive post-game. Later on we received Emerald as well, an enhanced version of Ruby and Sapphire, which added another fan favorite post-game element in the Battle Frontier. This would also continue to Generation 4 where we got a Battle Frontier later on, although Diamond and Pearl are notorious for not running so well on the original Nintendo DS. The new additions Diamond and Pearl added to Pokemon were less than previous generations, with the most impactful changes being the physical and special split for certain moves and online functionality. While these additions are more attributed to fixing old mechanics and online for Pokemon was more of a natural progression with technology in general, it was still really appreciated and very welcome at the time. More so than the previous generations, the Generation 4 games have more of a focus on a story with Team Galactic and also expand upon the lore behind the Pokemon universe thanks to Pokemon like Arceus and the stories in the Kanalave City Library. Much like Generation 3, the next games released in Generation 4, being Platinum as well as Heart Gold and Soul Silver, build upon Generation 4 to make them even better. Platinum expanded the post-game content of the Sinnoh region, while Heart Gold and Soul Silver are remakes of a fan-favorite Pokemon game being Gold and Silver, and are widely considered to be one of the best games in the entire Pokemon franchise, even over 10 years after their release. I could go on and on about Generation 4 as it is my favorite generation all around, but seeing as the topic of this video is more about classic Pokemon versus modern Pokemon as a whole, I think we've covered the most important elements for Generation 4 and what they added to the franchise as well as why people love it. So to wrap up the classic era of Pokemon, the most defining thing about it I've noticed is the natural progression each generation added from 1 to 4. While this will continue into Generation 5 and into the modern era a little bit, the impact that the first 4 generations had individually are much bigger than any of the changes that the new modern Pokemon games added. The games focus more on the trainer as well in the classic era rather than some sort of evil team or weird convoluted story, which I think is great. But now this brings us to a more transitional period of Generation 5. Generation 5 is currently going through the phase of being the most loved generation, something that pretty much every generation prior to it has gone through at one point or another in Pokemon's history. Generation 5 doesn't really add anything new to the Pokemon formula, as it really just expands upon what we already had prior. The most notable new addition added in Generation 5 was Triple Battles, which was then later removed in later generations. This trend of adding a new feature just to remove it a few generations later will be more popular in the modern era, which is one argument to why Pokemon Black and White as well as Black and White 2 could be considered part of the modern era. However, since Generation 5 are the last 2D Pokemon games and they fix a lot of the issues that Generation 4 had from a technical standpoint, that's another one of the arguments to consider it part of the classic era. As a purely transitional generation though, I think Generation 5 does a great job at being the separating factor between both eras, since Generation 5 was when Pokemon really started to get even easier. While it wasn't as prevalent as the changes we saw in Generation 6, Generation 5 was the first time we saw reusable TMs and less of a focus of HMs, which makes the game a little bit easier all around. Black and White 2 would at least introduce some sort of difficulty setting, but in order to unlock it you had to beat the game anyway. And generally speaking, if you've played through a game once, your second playthrough is usually easier anyway. And now we head into Generation 6, the start of the modern era where Pokemon saw a lot more changes. The most noticeable change is the transition to 3D from 2D, which is a pretty big step for Pokemon. While Generation 5 is praised for having a story that does take up much of the actual in-game content, X and Y also have a story, but it isn't nearly as developed as the story in Black and White and Black and White 2, but takes up even more of the major plot points compared to those games. While I personally like X and Y and think they're the best Pokemon games on the 3DS, it doesn't change the fact that they are some of the least liked Pokemon games out there due to the way the story is handled, as well as how much easier Pokemon became. X and Y gave us a revamped EXP share to give XP to all Pokemon in our party after battle, when prior to only gave XP to one Pokemon. While this can be seen as more of a quality of life change since grinding can be rather tedious in Pokemon games, it creates situations where your team becomes over-leveled easily, making battles a lot easier. On top of that, many of the important trainers like gym leaders only have 2 or 3 Pokemon on their team, while you still have access to a full team of 6. When combined with over-leveled Pokemon, it means that every important battle becomes super easy and can make some players lose interest in the game. The other key addition Generation 6 had was Mega Evolution, however much like Triple Battles from Generation 5, they would be removed in later games. While Mega Evolution was generally liked among Pokemon fans, it still received its fair share of backlash. On top of this, Generation 6 was when we started to see less new Pokemon added to the Pokemon franchise, as only 72 new Pokemon were added in Pokemon X and Y, compared to the 100 Pokemon added in Gold and Silver, which was the previous lowest count. In the end, I still think X and Y are good Pokemon games, but there's no denying that X and Y felt different than any of the other previous Pokemon games before it. After Pokemon X and Y, we got Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, which did exactly what every other second game on a new console did for Pokemon. It added more to the base versions of Pokemon X and Y, which were pretty bare bone, much like how Diamond and Pearl were until Heart Gold and Soul Silver and Platinum came out to flesh out the 4th generation. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire added new Megas, which was great and had somewhat of a post-game with the Delta missions, as X and Y pretty much had no post-game whatsoever outside of the boring looker missions, which took like 20 minutes to complete. Overall, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire did a good job rounding out the 6th generation, although the lack of a true follow-up to the Kalos region was rather unfortunate and unprecedented in Pokemon up until this point. I think that this is the biggest issue with Generation 6. It's not so much that the games themselves this generation did really anything that bad aside from being a little too easy, it was more so the fact that it felt like Generation 6 had a lot more to offer and we never really got to see what Generation 6 truly could have became. This leads us into the Generation 7 era of Pokemon, where we got Sun and Moon as well as the Ultra games, with the new gimmick this time being Z-moves, which again was removed in later installments of Pokemon. This mechanic was less liked than Mega Evolution amongst Pokemon fans, and pretty much pushed Mega Evolution to the side as Megas weren't prevalent at all in the main story of Alola and were pushed to the post-game. While people might say that Z-moves were the big new addition Generation 7, I'd also argue that the introduction of Alolan forms was even bigger. Unlike Z-moves, Alolan forms still exist in every Pokemon game released after Sun and Moon, and they do a great job at essentially adding new Pokemon without actually adding new Pokemon, since Alolan forms take existing Pokemon and reimagine them to fit the new region that they're based off of. Out of all of the key changes in the modern era of Pokemon, this is the one that stuck and feels the most like an addition that they would have added in the classic era, as the majority of the big changes from the classic era are still prevalent in Pokemon today. Sun and Moon also completely changed the Pokemon formula, something that we have wanted for a while, by having more of a focus on a story that doesn't involve becoming the champion, and replacing gyms with island trials, which still function pretty similarly. This is rather polarizing among Pokemon fans since there's people who really like the change and some people who don't. Generation 7 is personally my least favorite generation because I'm really not a fan of how much of a focus the game has on a story, which really isn't a good story in my opinion, and how much easier the games are than in Generation 6. While the difficulty is ramped up a little bit in the Ultra games to make them harder than the Generation 6 games, the flow of the Alola-based games is interrupted far too much by NPCs guiding you, telling you where to go, or explaining something about the story. There's even points where you talk to an NPC with a cutscene, walk down the road, and then trigger another cutscene immediately. I think Generation 7 share a lot of the same flaws with Generation 6, with the exception of the difficulty being slightly easier in Generation 6, largely due to the Ultra games being a bit harder, which is a big trend for the modern Pokemon games. I do appreciate that they did try to have more of an emphasis on a story, since prior to that we didn't really have much of a good story in Pokemon, but I think the way they handled it is just so bad and way worse than what they did in Generation 5. I'll briefly touch on the Let's Go games here, since they are technically part of Generation 7 apparently, but they're essentially just Generation 1 remakes in 3D. Unlike Fire Red and Leaf Green, the Let's Go games are more like Pokemon Yellow than anything else, and although they are technically main series games, they do feel more different than any other Pokemon game, mainly because of the different catching mechanic. I will say that the Let's Go games are easier than Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, and although Pokemon has always been targeted towards a children's audience more than anyone else, the Let's Go games feel more like a kid's game than any other main series Pokemon game. I don't think they're bad games exactly, but they don't really add too much to the Pokemon franchise as a whole. I guess it's the first game with compatibility with Pokemon Go on the phone, and that's really about it. And now we get to the last game and the most controversial Pokemon games, Pokemon Sword and Shield. The elephant in the room here would be the lack of a full Pokedex in Sword and Shield upon release, which luckily did receive a couple of free updates since to add back some of the older Pokemon, although at this point in time we still don't have every single Pokemon in Sword and Shield. In Generation 8, we saw the removal of Z-moves, which were also absent from the Let's Go games by the way, and the removal of Mega Evolution, which was brushed to the side in most of Generation 7, but still had a pretty big emphasis in the Let's Go games. The big key mechanic added in Generation 8 this time was Dynamaxing and Gigantamaxing, which, to put in the simplest way possible, is basically a watered down form of Mega Evolution from Generation 6. I personally think Gigantamaxing is cooler than Dynamaxing, since the Pokemon actually change in appearance like they do with Megas, while Dynamaxing feels just a little weird. I don't hate it, but knowing that any Pokemon can just get really big for no reason and have really strong attacks just feels weird. Aside from that, we have an expansion upon Alolan forms with Galarian forms, which are basically the same as Alolan forms, but for Galar. Unlike the Alolan forms though, some Galarian forms evolve into Pokemon that did not exist prior, such as Galarian Linoone evolving to Obstagoon, while regular Linoone is still a final form Pokemon that doesn't evolve. I'd also like to praise Pokemon Sword and Shield for the return to having the focus being on the trainer. While some people don't like the story of Sword and Shield, doesn't really make much sense and really isn't explained well in the story, at least as well as it should have been, I personally prefer it when games focus on you becoming the champion, much like games in the classic era did. This makes parts of Pokemon Sword and Shield feel more like classic Pokemon, although there are still some really easy instances and other factors that make people really dislike these games. Sword and Shield have arguably the worst evil team in any generation by far with Team Yell, which don't really do anything or add anything to the game. We did get 2 DLC packs, which I think really do add a lot to Sword and Shield and make them a lot more fun, giving you a lot more to do as well, but it doesn't change the fact that there's still a lot of other issues with Sword and Shield that people didn't like or upset about. Luckily, Generation 8 isn't over yet, and I expect there to be at least one more new Pokemon game in the Generation 8 timeline before we jump to Generation 9 and potentially start a new era of Pokemon. So to wrap up the modern era of Pokemon from Generation 6 to now, the key takeaway here is they started making the games much easier and started experimenting with weirder gimmicks that didn't stick, unlike in the classic era of Pokemon where there was a lot of innovation and key mechanics like breeding, abilities, and online battling, which were all added after Generation 1 and still remain in the game today. The classic era focuses more on the story of your trainer becoming the champion, while Generation 5 and the modern era focus more on a general story with an evil team, and it's up to you to decide which one you prefer. While the entirety of this video is entirely subjective and it went on for way longer than I thought, I personally have to give the edge to classic Pokemon. Nostalgia may be a key factor, but whenever I find myself going back to play a Pokemon game, it's almost always a game from the first 5 generations, where aside from playing Pokemon Sword and Shield DLCs as they come out, I don't really play modern Pokemon that much at all. The classic era added a lot more defining factors to Pokemon, unlike the modern era which introduced some new things only to remove them later on. I don't think the modern era is bad by any means, as I still have had a lot of fun with all the games in the modern era with the exception of maybe the Ultra Sun and Moon games. But there's no denying that Generation 6 onwards just feels a lot different than the first 4 generations. So what do you guys think? Do you prefer modern Pokemon or classic Pokemon, and why? Let me know in the comment section down below, and also consider leaving a like if you made it this far in the video, since it helps the channel a ton, and subscribe with notifications turned on so you don't miss any future Pokemon videos. Thank you all so much for watching, have a great rest of your day, I'll see you all next time, and bye bye.